Hello, this is Ghost Town Bob, and I'm coming to you today with another in my series about Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and the Wild Bunch. In this series, I give you the truth, celebrate the legends, and expose the myths about Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and the Wild Bunch. And so let's get started today. And I want to talk a little bit about the origin of the term Wild Bunch as it relates to Butch Cassidy and his gang, and to answer the question, were they really called the Wild Bunch? As part of my presentation, I'm going to be referring to this article here. Yes, they really were called the Wild Bunch. Well, some of them. An article by Mike Bell that appeared in the December 2019 issue of the Tombstone Epitaph. The Wild Bunch. When we talk about the Wild Bunch, a lot of us think about uh, outlaws such as Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, Will Carver, Harvey Logan, and Ben Kilpatrick, and the famous Fort Worth Five photograph, and think that it refers to all of the outlaws that were in Western America in the late 1890s and early 1900s. And this is not particularly true. As of late, there's been revisionist historians and trying to write revisionist history about the origin of the term Wild Bunch as it refers to Butch Cassidy and the other outlaws that associated with him. And these historians have basically claimed that the term Wild Bunch was not officially used to refer to the various gangs in Robbers Roost, the Brown's Hole, and the Hole in the Rock. It was not officially used until 1902 when the Pinkerton's National Detective Agency coined the phrase or repeated the phrase in a report that they issued to the American Bankers Association, whom they were representing and trying to catch these outlaws. They say that it was not really coined and used before that, except locally possibly, but that the official date of the naming, quote unquote, naming of the Wild Bunch was uh, this Pinkerton National Detective Agency report. And Mike Bell is one of those that says that really the major use of the name was did not happen until then, and then he goes on and talks a little bit about how locally the name Wild Bunch may have been used for at least some of the outlaws that ran around with Butch Cassidy, but not necessarily him or just the group that around Brown's Hole. So let's go ahead, and I want to just quote a little bit from this article. He says, in recent years, however, historians, including myself, that's Mike Bell, have challenged the Pinkertons' use of the term Wild Bunch, noting that it had been applied to the Doolin Dalton gang of the early 1890s. That was a gang in Oklahoma that was quite famous. And also to the Alvord Stiles gang in 1898, but doubting that it had ever been used to describe the various gangs which Logan, Cassidy, and Longabaugh had associated at the time they were active. For some years, the position has been that the term was coined by the Pinkertons just as the men who made up the gangs in question were being killed off or had fled the country, but that it was never applied to them in their heyday. the Powder Springs Gang, the Robbers Roost Gang, the Hole in the Wall Gang, the Diamond Mountain Gang, and others. Other local titles were used, but not the Wild Bunch. Then he goes on and talks a little bit uh, about how the origin or the start of the use of that name occurred, and concluding that it was used locally in some of the local press, but that it was kind of nebulous and not really used uh, for the gang until uh, until late. And so let's go ahead and investigate that and see uh, what the truth of the matter is. Was there really a wild bunch, and did that refer to the gang or gangs that were associated with Butch Cassidy? Uh, First of all, one of the sources that is used uh, to look into that is this report here by the Pinkerton's National Detective Agency. This was issued about 1907, so it was a good 5 years after the ABA report. But in this, they quote or they have a quote in here about the formation of the gang, since the paper is about the history of the Wild Bunch. It says a gang existed in this area referred to, meaning the Mountain West, to of those less is generally known, but whose widespread criminal activities as train and bank robbers extended in a trail of outlawry which extended practically from the Canadian border to Old Mexico. This gang, on account of their recklessness and vicious habits, were known by the well-merited title of the Wild Bunch. So by 1907, of course, the term Wild Bunch was being used, and in many local papers or in many national papers, it was being used by this time. But the Pinkertons seems to have been of the opinion that uh, the term was used to refer to the Wild Bunch uh, during its heyday, that it was referred to by the well-merited title of the Wild Bunch. Let's look at what the origins are to the term Wild Bunch, and we'll examine some of these claims and see how they hold out. The first mention of the Wild Bunch in print anywhere was in a Salt Lake Herald uh, article on July 26, 1897. Now, the Salt Lake Herald, Mike Bell claims that it was called, it was the Salt Lake Herald Republican, was what the name of it was. It was generally referred to as the Salt Lake Herald. It had just recently merged with the Republican. Uh, but throughout his article, he refers to it as the Salt Lake Republican, but it was always known as the Salt Lake Herald, and sometimes as the Herald Republican after the merger. Uh, he claims that the first use of the title was in relation to a family of outlaws that moved into the Browns Park area on Diamond Mountain in Utah uh, during the mid 1890s, around 1895 or 96. And these were cattlemen, and they were very much opposed to sheep being herded in the area. And so they uh, went out and attacked some of the sheep herders, injured some of the sheep herders, killed many of their sheep, at least 12 or more bucks, as they called them, or the rams were killed, as well as a lot of the ewes and the other sheep. So anyway, the apostles turned out to gather the McKee boys up, as they were called, the McKee boys, and bring them to justice. And two of the McKee boys, I think it was Jim and Tom, or a couple, anyway, a couple of the boys. There was four of them. They're able to capture and bring back into Vernal, and in this article on July 26, 1897, it says nearly all of the sheepmen are losers, and the McKee boys will have a hard time to clear themselves with the evidence said to be against them. It was the opinion of a great many people that the work was done by the Wild Bunch, uh, not with capital letters, but with the lowercase letters. But as no such gang is known to exist, only in imagination, the sheepmen are satisfied they have the right men, and will bring all the evidence forward to convict them that they can. So this article, it's right here, uh, quotes and says that, well, it says that a lot of the local people said, well, this was work of the Wild Bunch, which indicates that there was a group of outlaws, or somebody that was called the Wild Bunch, but that they said kind of sarcastically or tongue in cheek, uh, but as no such gang is known to exist, only in imagination. Uh, Mike Bell says, well, that proves that really there wasn't a gang called the Wild Bunch at the time, and it was the paper's opinion that it was only imagination. I take that a little bit differently and say that when they say that no such gang is known to exist, only in the imagination, what they're saying is there was a gang or a group called the Wild Bunch, but that the official uh, term was not used, or that the government officials or town officials or local officials refused to recognize that there was any such gang, and they were just telling people, well, it's only your imagination. Something that we kind of get nowadays with some of our political maneuvering that goes on in the United States now, with both sides calling the other's opinions only imagination. The second article he quotes is from the Vernal Express, almost a year later, on May 5th, 1898, which only is a passing term to the term Wild Bunch, but it does show that the term was out there and that it was actually being used. In 1898, there was recruiting going on to uh, recruit for the Spanish-American War, and in the Vernal area, there was only one recruit that had signed up to go fight in the Spanish-American War. And so the paper had just a little snippet here. This is the article and the little snippet. Uh, and talking about really no one signing up for to volunteer for the Spanish-American War. It says the name of Ed Hunter stands alone on the volunteer list of Uintah County up to yesterday. A great many of our citizens think they have their hands full looking after the Wild Bunch. Okay, so again, here, what it's saying is a lot of the local citizens by 1898, May of 1898, were busy looking after the concerns of the Wild Bunch. Again, uh, Mike Bell seems to intimate, though he doesn't actually come out and say it, that this is really just as much about the McKee boys or some of the other local outlaws there, and didn't particularly be talking about the overall uh, Brown's Hole gang or the Powder River gang or anybody associated with Butch Cassidy. Of course, by this time in July of 1897, the Castle Gate robbery had occurred, and this almost a year later, they still hadn't found the perpetual or the uh, those that had uh, taken part in the robbery. And so, yes, there were concerns in the Vernal area about the gang, which they termed, at least locally, as the Wild Bunch. The next article that is quoted is the Salt Lake Republican, the 2nd of September, 1899. Well, actually, there was one just right before that, the 13th of June, 1899. And I'll quote both of these here kind of together. The first one is titled Not at the Strip, Sheriff Priest of Uinta sought for roosters in vain. And it goes on and says, towards the end here, Sheriff Priest is one of the most fearless men in the state, and and any members of the Wild Bunch, if any of the members of the Wild Bunch uh, turn up, he, meaning Sheriff Priest, will be heard from. And this is rumors that were circulating about Butch Cassidy and Elzaleh possibly hanging around uh, the the strip, which is what it was called, which is a strip of saloons and body houses that were by Fort Duchesne, in an area that had been taken off from the Uinta Indian Reservation, and at the time had no there wasn't any law jurisdiction in the area because it was a disputed area uh, between different entities. Uinta County didn't claim it. The government didn't claim it. The Indians didn't claim it. Nobody claimed it, and so uh, that's why this area was built up with saloons and body houses and things like that to serve the soldiers from Fort Duchesne. The second one was printed not long afterwards on the 2nd of September, 1899. That's this one here, in Vernal Notes, and it talks about a bank possibly uh, being established in Vernal, which had not had a bank yet. And it says basically that the concerns were that with the outlaws locally, that if they had established a bank earlier, then it would have been robbed. Uh, so it says there are rumors afloat that Vernal will have a bank in the near future. The advisability of such a move has been under consideration at different times, but owing to the locality and the frequent visitations of the Wild Bunch, the plan has never been carried out, as the risk was considered too great. So those are the four articles that are mentioned in this article, and each of them indicate that at least locally there was a gang that was was called the Wild Bunch, and it was associated with Butch Cassidy, but it was just locally and didn't apply outside of the general area. Of course, nowadays we think of the Wild Bunch as being all over the place, up in Wyoming and Colorado and Utah and in Arizona and New Mexico. But these articles indicate that the term wild bunch is being used at least locally. Now, one article that Mike Bell neglected to quote is this article here from the Denver Rocky Mountain News, and this is a very interesting article. It was written before these last three articles were written. This was written on the 7th of March, 1898, which is a good deal earlier than those last three articles. And it talks about uh, who they call Bush Cassidy and the gangs of outlaws that were associated with Butch Cassidy at that time. At this time, during the late winter during the winter and spring of 1898, there was much discussion amongst people in Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah about trying to get rid of the robbers that frequented uh, those three states and was basically uh, centered in the Bags, Powder Springs, Browns Park area of Utah and Idaho, and they hid there because they would go back and forth between the states after some robbery or something, and they'd be able to hide out from the law. And so, if posses came out, posses wouldn't be able to go across the state lines and go after them. And so the governors of the three states had met together and were discussing plans for possibly organizing a tri-state posse of some sort to go in and rout out these outlaws from the areas. And this particular article talks about uh, not only the uh, outlaws that are around Browns Park, but also the outlaws that are in Hole in the Wall up in Wyoming and Robber's Roost down in Utah. And it talks specifically about Butch Cassidy being one of the leaders or the leader of this gang of outlaws. Whether or not he actually was the leader of the outlaws, some said that there was 500 outlaws that were hiding out in these areas, and their strongholds were so strong that posses couldn't go in and get them because they had automatic weapons and Gatling guns. I think this late they even said machine guns and uh, and other heavy equipment, dynamite that they'd blow up anybody that tried to go in after them. Anyway, uh, this particular one that says that the Butch Cassidy was one of the leaders of the gangs, and so it says here. The leader and commander of the gang is Bush Cassidy. He is known all over the cattle country as a genuine bad man around Powder Springs, Dixon, and Baggs, small towns near the border of Colorado. It is not a secret that the members of the gang have forged a sort of a military company, which is kind of interesting. This goes along with that exaggeration and speculation that the press had that there was 500 outlaws. It goes on and it says the company is known as the Wild Bunch. And in this article, it is capitalized, Wild Bunch, meaning that was its title, and that it is known as the Wild Bunch, which means that Butch Cassidy uh, recognized that as the name also. Uh, it goes on to say, last July, the Wild Bunch entered the town of Dixon and proceeded to shoot it up, which actually happened, and shooting up a town, everything which can be broken with a bullet is sacrificed, especially the necks of bottles and oil lamps. Although the Wild Bunch sometimes divides into very small companies, Butch Cassidy still remains the poobah, a sort of brigadier general. He is described as an individual utterly without conscience or fear. And then it goes on and talks about the robbery at Castle Gate and some of the other depredations that had taken place. So the conclusion of this, at least in my opinion, is that yes, there was a band of outlaws that went from a robber's roost, because we know that that the outlaws in Robber's Roost and the outlaws in Brown's Hole circulated back and forth. Sometimes they were down there, sometimes they were in Brown's Hole, sometimes they were up in Hole in the Wall. That it was being called, at least by uh, March of 1898, it was being called the Wild Bunch. And so the other mentions in the Utah papers referring to the Wild Bunch is just following up on this, that the gangs were really, the conglomeration of the gangs was called the Wild Bunch. Now, as time went on, the Wild Bunch changed a little bit. Butch Cassidy went down to the WS Ranch in New Mexico and spent time down there. and other members of the gang, the Sundance Kid, whom Butch Cassidy would have met about this time of this article in 1897 or 1898, uh, because uh, Longabaugh was in the Dixon Savory Bags area for well over a year. Uh, that these outlaws and the other associated outlaws were known as the Wild Bunch, even though different parts of that larger gang were known as, say, the Powder Springs Gang or the Robbers Roost Gang or the Hole in the Wall Gang. So that's my summary of it. I do believe that the Wild Bunch was called the Wild Bunch and not just by these other names solely, and that by 1900 and even up into 1902, when the gangs were broken up, they were called the Wild Bunch. And so, as the officials came and cleaned them out. That's why the Pinkertons National Detective Agency used the blanket term Wild Bunch to refer to all of them, because that was used even by the outlaws themselves to refer uh, to their gangs. So that's it for today. If you have any comments, go ahead and post them. I will be glad to read them. You may disagree with me vehemently, and then we can have a further discussion. That this may be only one part of my discussion on the term wild bunch. There are more sources and information that I have that I can present. So that's it for today, and we'll talk again more about Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch.